we're certainly very excited about having Dr. Gary Houchens with us today. Dr. Houchens has become a friend and he's a great guy, and he's become a friend, and I'm really glad to call him my friend and colleague in this effort of education reform. Dr. Houchens is the Associate Professor of Educational Administration, Leadership, and Research right here at Western Kentucky University. He's also a member of the Bluegrass Institute Board of Scholars, and he received an undergraduate and master's degree from Western here, his MAT in Education Administration from Oakland City University, and his PhD in Education, Leadership, and Organizational Development from a school you might have heard of called the University of Louisville, 2008. 2007, Dr. Houchens was awarded Principal of the Year for his work with at-risk students and their families. The award was given by Family Works Therapy right here in Bowling Green. Dr. Houchens is married to Holly. He has 2 young children. And on his very fine blog called School Leader, one of my favorite blogs outside of bips.org, it's found at schoolleader/typepad.com. Dr. Houchens writes, and I quote, "Organizations that don't face some degree of customer choice and competition have far less incentive to think outside the box and be innovative," end quote. And of course, that's talking about our public education system. And here to talk more about that and the ideas he has on school choice, would you welcome, please, Dr. Gary Houchens.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is a real pleasure to be here. Most appreciative of Jim for inviting me to do this, Mark for your sponsorship, a lot of work Kelly put into putting this together today, and I want to thank Richard Dennis, education analyst for the Bluegrass Institute. Without him, I'm not sure any of us would be here having this conversation, because he has done such amazing work in helping to create a case for school choice in Kentucky and helping us understand what the education landscape here really looks like. And I want to thank all of you for being here too. It's good to be with other people interested in this issue, as some people often speculate that I'm a bit of an anomaly being a member of the educational establishment and an advocate for school choice, and there is some truth to that. This is one of those situations where I've been instructed when I'm advocating for specific legislation to say that my views expressed today are mine alone and do not represent those of Western Kentucky University or anyone who's associated with the university. And it is also true that certainly if you get your information through the media, the teachers' unions and the professional organizations for school administrators are very vocal opponents of school choice. But I have to tell you that I encounter an increasing number of people who work within the educational establishment, longtime friends and colleagues of mine, students of mine at the university, who will quietly tell me, often in a whisper, "I believe in school choice too." And the numbers of those people continue to increase, I think in part because they're convinced by some of the information that we'll discuss today, and also by their experiences. You know, no one can accuse me of being a part of some corporate conspiracy to destroy public education, because other than a couple of years that I worked in parochial schools, I've dedicated my entire career to public schools and public school students as a teacher and as an administrator, and now the primary function that I play at the university is training the next generation of school administrators who are, by and large, all going to work in public schools. I've visited excellent public schools. I've also seen some of the worst that we have to offer. But one of the things I've become convinced of in these 20 years is that no school, no matter how good it is, can meet the needs of every child. Education is just too unique an experience, and the values of each individual family and the goals that they have for their children are too personal for us to assume that any one institution can provide for the needs of every single child. And so once I got to the university, I started speaking and writing openly about my support for school choice. I wrote an op-ed for the Lexington Trail Leader in support of charter schools. And Nick and I saw that and reached out to me, and we began what has become a very fruitful dialogue and partnership. A couple of years ago, Jim invited me to serve on the Board of Scholars for the Institute, and that's a great honor. I'm the only non-economist in that group, but consider myself in very good company. And I'm very happy to be a part of what the Institute is trying to do. In my talk today, I'd kind of like to highlight some of the important work that the Institute has done in education reform in general, and how collaboratively we are starting to define what school choice policy in Kentucky can, and we believe very soon will look like. So that's what I want to focus on. I want to start by making just a mention of the Institute's mission. There are 3 pillars to Bluegrass Institute's mission, and everything that it does revolves around these 3 principles of transparency in government, giving citizens the tools for action to have a voice and a sense of control over what happens in their government entities, so that they can hold elected and appointed leaders accountable for the work that they're going to do. And so I think we'll see that in our discussion of education, all 3 of these principles are certainly at work. So I think there are 2 key ways that the Institute's making a difference in the education landscape, and I want to elaborate on these 2 points. First of all, the Bluegrass Institute is doing enormously important work in defining the precise educational challenges that the state is currently facing. And then secondly, by articulating strategy solutions to effectively address those challenges. And of course, one of those solutions is expanding the education options for all Kentucky families, and that's going to be our primary focus here. So first I want to highlight 3 key ways that the Institute is helping to define the real education challenge. First of all, we spend a lot of money on education, as Jim just noted, in this state and in our country. In fact, about 40% of the state budget goes to K-12 education. But that doesn't mean that every dollar spent on education has the same effect. And so the Institute has done some excellent work in exploring which school districts do the best job with the resources that they have. And secondly, like most states, Kentucky has some glaring historical learning gaps for children of color, children of poverty, students with disabilities, and English language learners. So here too, the Institute has made some powerful contributions to making these achievement gaps more easily understood. And whatever progress our schools in Kentucky may be making, our accountability and testing system has some serious flaws. And those flaws hide, or they at least obscure, some real problem areas in student learning in this state. And the Institute is one of the state's most articulate critics of these flaws, and a tireless advocate for reforms to make the accountability system more clear and more accurate. So let's look at each of these areas in particular. We'll start with educational efficiency. In 2006 and then again in 2012, the Institute conducted the only publicly available study of educational efficiency in the Commonwealth. It's probably one of the few that has ever been done in the country. The bang for the buck reports calculate a ratio of Kentucky school district per pupil spending to its achievement level. And this ratio is called the Spending Score Index, and it reveals which districts are the most effective at using taxpayer dollars to promote student achievement. Through this analysis, the Institute identified 4 school districts that they call diamonds in the rough. And these were districts that, even though they had high levels of student poverty, were nevertheless achieving at relatively high levels and with high graduation rates. It didn't mean that they were the top districts in the state, but they were getting higher levels of achievement than demographically similar districts, using basically the same or even less resources. These districts included Eminence Independent, Graves County, LaRue County, and the Mason County schools. In a press conference featuring Institute staff, the superintendents of those 4 districts, and representatives from the Kentucky Department of Education was held to celebrate this distinction and to urge other school districts to study what these diamond in the rough school districts are actually doing, so that they can emulate some of their strategies. The Bang for the Buck report also contributed to some intense discussions about the need to reform Kentucky's system of school accounting, which I'll say more about in just a moment. And I'm happy to say that Dick is currently working on the 2016 edition of Bang for the Buck, and it's going to include some new measures, some new metrics for establishing educational efficiency, so we can look forward to that in the days ahead. So a second key way that the Institute is helping define the education challenge is by exposing some of our most glaring disparities in educational achievement. And the best example of this comes from a series of reports called Blacks Falling Through the Gaps. Again, this was authored by Dick Ennis. The latest version is Blacks Continue Falling Through the Gaps, and it was released in February of this year. These reports take a close-up examination of achievement gaps in the Jefferson County Public Schools, which is, of course, Louisville and our state's largest school district. The latest report shows that not only are white students continuing to outperform their black peers at an alarmingly high rate, but those gaps are actually growing larger. And in some JCPS schools, the proficiency rate between whites and blacks is in excess of 50 points. So the situation there is getting worse and not better. This year's report also makes a new contribution by challenging the state's method of reporting graduation and college and career readiness rates, which, based on KDE statistics, look like they're getting better. But Dick's analysis showed that the percentage of students achieving college and career readiness is dramatically lower than the percentage of students graduating, which means that a lot of these kids are getting out of high school and they're really nowhere near prepared for college or for careers. And now, while some of the schools that are on Louisville's west side have long been criticized for their poor performance, the latest gaps report also reveals that the largest achievement gaps in JCPS are actually found east of I-65 in the more affluent areas of the county. Some of those schools are officially designated as proficient or even distinguished, even though they have these super large achievement gaps. And so this suggests that the state's accountability system is not doing a great job at identifying performance problems in our schools. And we'll turn to that again in just a moment. Last thing I want to note here is that this year's GAPS report was released in a press conference in front of the JCPS central offices. And the Institute staff were there, but they were joined by representatives from the Kentucky Pastors in Action Coalition, which is a group of African-American ministers from the Louisville area. That group is convinced that we need dramatic changes in education policy to address these equity issues. JCPS says that they have school choice within the district, so there are some mechanisms by which you get to choose from among the JCPS offerings, and yet this latest GAPS report makes it clear that even if you choose the best schools in the district, those are still greatly underserving our African-American students, and so something more dramatic is definitely necessary. The next thing I want to note here is that this GAPS report serves as a good example of the third way that the Institute helps make clear the real challenges that we're facing, by exposing flaws in the school accountability system itself. The GAPS report illustrates how schools can be labeled as proficient or distinguished even though they have these serious achievement gaps. And Dick has also worked to show how the state standardized testing system, which is called unbridled learning, appears to inflate student achievement. So he's looked at the gap between Kentucky students' performance on K-Prep, which is our state standardized assessment system, compared to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the NAEP test. And that gap between K-Prep and NAEP has grown wider over the last 3 years. So again, this suggests that at least in math and reading, Kentucky students aren't doing nearly as well as what our state accountability system would suggest. All right. So Dick's also shown how the system's use of self-reported data like program reviews, this is a process that we use for our non-tested subject areas, are not reliable because they rely on the schools to evaluate their own performance. And that further contributes to sort of disguising the deeper levels of performance issues that exist within our schools. That's a fact that even our new Education Commissioner, Stephen Pruitt, has started to acknowledge and is taking some steps to try to correct. So the Institute's done some great work in defining the educational challenges, but isn't content just to point out the flaws. The Institute also works hard to articulate the kind of policy solutions that would really make a difference in improving the education system. So the Bank for the Buck report, for example, it's made it clear that the state's computer-based accounting system, it's called UNIS, that the schools use, has multiple flaws. 10 years after that first Bank for the Buck report, the Department of Education is still struggling to try to improve that process so we get a clearer idea of where our educational dollars are actually being spent. In a similar vein, the Institute has insisted on transparency in the workings of government education entities through open records challenges to the State Board of Education and local boards of education as well. In 2011, the Institute did a report called Rubber Stamping Failure. That was bringing attention to the issue of compensation and evaluation for superintendents. That led to improvements in the training of school board members and to the public release of superintendent evaluation information. So in all these ways, the Institute is leveraging all the research that is done to make differences in policy and practice. So the central focus of the Institute's advocacy work is really working with coalition partners across the state to give every family the right to choose from the school of their own choice, because this is, we believe, the ultimate method of accountability for all of our schools. So let's talk about that for a minute. Start by defining what we mean by the term school choice. Essentially, school choice policies recognize that while education is a public good and it deserves public funding, that families should have their choice from a wide array of education providers. Usually, but not always, this means that some or all of the public funds allocated for education for the individual student should follow that child to the school of his or her choice rather than be allocated directly to a school district, which is usually the one where the child resides. So to understand better how that might work in Kentucky, it's important to think about how we fund schools here. The state government allocates K-12 education dollars through a formula called SEEK. That's an acronym for Support Education Excellence in Kentucky. This school year, the base SEEK amount worked out to about $3,981 per pupil. And they adjust this amount upward or downward based on the demographics of the schools that are served, and then you get a district-specific per pupil SEEK allotment. So locally, what that means is that, for example, Bowling Green Independent School District, their adjusted SEEK for this year is just under $4,500. For the Warren County Public Schools, it's just under $3,700. Of course, this does not account for all of the money that's spent on education. In Kentucky, an average of about 30% of education dollars are generated locally, and about 12% is federal. So there's a lot more money spent on education than this. In Bowling Green, for example, I think the total average per pupil spending is around $10,000 a year. And so the idea with school choice is that some, at least the state amount, if not all of that expenditure should follow the child to the school of his or her choice. Why would we do that? I think there are three key arguments for school choice. The first one is that it's fair. The second one is that it is consistent with other types of public services that require sort of individualized touch. And the third is that it just simply works. And so I want to talk about each one of those. First of all, it's important to state the obvious, that affluent families already have school choice. If we have the income, then we can buy a home in the school district or the school zone of our desiring, or we can afford private school tuition. It's only low-income and lower middle-income families that basically have to take whatever it is that the local educational agency is providing for you. And I think there's an interesting argument to be made here as well, that low-income families may actually pay a disproportionate amount of their income toward education, because even though low-income families tend to rent, basically what that means is they pay their landlord's property taxes without getting any of the tax benefits of home ownership. So in that way, they're probably paying more than their fair share for education and are often consigned to the lowest performing schools. So at the most basic level, it's a social justice and it's an equity issue. But it's also inconsistent to the way we do other public services. You know, we don't tell food stamp recipients that they have to go to a government-run grocery store to buy food. Even and in healthcare, at least for the time being, we tell Medicaid patients and Medicare recipients, take your government healthcare funds to the doctor or hospital of your choice. So sometimes I hear my colleagues criticize school choice because they say it drains money from traditional public schools. Well, you can only make that argument based on this kind of logic of the way we fund our schools. 2 hospitals here in Bowling Green. We don't ever say that the medical center drains money from Greenview because someone chooses to use their Medicare benefit at the other hospital. We don't think that way because we don't care where they go as long as they're getting quality care. The point is that we're funding health care. We're not propping up a healthcare monopoly as we're doing in education. And it doesn't even apply to higher education either, because if you think about Pell Grant or the GI Bill, no one tells those folks where they have to go to university or post-secondary education. So it's only in K-12 education that we deny low-income families the dignity of making a choice that is every bit as personal as the doctor that you go to see. And so in this way, it loops us back to the equity and the justice argument for school choice. But beyond all that, it's important to note that school choice actually does work to improve student achievement, not just for the students who follow to a school of their own choice, but to the students who stay behind in traditional public school environments. So Mark mentioned the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice. They do some of the best work out there on analyzing the empirical research data on school choice. Just mention, this is their latest report, Pursuing Innovation, but I'm actually synthesizing about 3 different Friedman reports from the last few years. One of which looked at 36 research studies. These are independent, not conducted by the Friedman Foundation itself. What they found is that in 11 of those 36 studies, there were positive outcomes for the children who left their assigned school to take advantage of the school choice policy. 21 of those studies also found positive outcomes for the kids who stayed behind, because now they're in a competitive education environment where their home school, their assigned school, has an incentive to do better. And none of the studies there were a couple of studies that had no effect, but none of them showed a negative effect from school choice. In another study, this actual Pursuing Innovation, they looked at 42 studies, 30 of which showed student achievement in traditional schools. In other words, the folks who stayed behind actually increased in those school choice environments. And another analysis, and by the way, no negative effects out of those 42 either. They're just 12 that had neither positive nor negative outcomes. Another study, another analysis of 18 studies looked at non-academic outcomes, and from those they found that school choice policies had had a positive impact in terms of racial segregation, the impact on taxpayers, and the civic engagement levels of the students. So there's abundant evidence here that we have everything to gain and virtually nothing to lose by becoming one of the states that embraces school choice.
That second bullet point, did it matter how many children left as far as the scores, or, I mean, like, the more left, did they get even better? Or?
Right, that may be addressed in the report, and I don't know for sure what impact that had. Like, at what point do you have to have enough students leave to make that difference, and then is there a point at which sort of the returns diminish on that?
You would think that would be the case.
You would think so, right. So it would suggest that, a little school choice may get you a little bit, but a lot of school choice may get you a lot of impact. That would be an important thing to know.
Caroline Hoxby had done some work on that in Michigan. She found that with charter schools in particular, that where at least 6% of students have left the traditional school, that it caused improvement in the school.
Okay.
And that's been a little bit dated, it was a few years.
And given the demand for school choice, which we'll look at on this next slide here, I think there's a good possibility that you hit that 6% threshold pretty easily if you give folks meaningful options.
I was just going to add, and I have the benefit of having talked to the Friedman Foundation just a couple of days ago. So I actually used the same statistic Dr. Houchens just used about studies showing improvement. There will be a new report coming out where there have been, I think, 2 studies that have shown a negative impact. So just be aware of that. 'Cause it was so nice to be able to say, well, no study did, but now we're having to say a little bit more nuanced. But those two studies, the Freedom Foundation will be updating its research, and there's some specific stuff with those two studies where it all dealt with Louisiana and a program there that just wasn't well designed, a poorly designed voucher program, and you know, as Dr. Houchens can talk about more, it's not just getting school choice, it's getting good legislation that's actually going to give families more options and attract quality schools, and they had a real problem with attracting quality schools because they designed a poor program that nobody wanted to participate in. So just so you're aware of that.
Yeah. The enabling legislation is what makes a huge difference. So if your best private schools say that too many strings attached to this, we don't want to participate, then that's really going to diminish the market itself. So
Yeah, when we talk Louisiana too, I think I have to interject. We're talking a very special case because this is a charter school state with a lot of choice, very powerful. And for those who would like to know how that's worked out for them, I do have a blog here showing how Louisiana's ACT scores compare for our scores race by race, and it's a very interesting blog, and I'll be happy to talk to that subject later.
Yeah, this had specifically to do with their voucher program, where if a school wanted to participate in their voucher program, they had to do state testing, there were caps on how much money could be accepted for tuition, and so basically what ended up happening is all the good non-public schools said, we don't want to bother with this, because this is going to give us a bunch of red tape that we don't want, we don't need. But the schools that were bad non-public schools that just needed the money said, hey, we'll take all the red tape we can get as long as the government cuts the right checks. And so that's what, it really has to do with specifically with the voucher program, which I know they've done a lot with charters and other things that have been very positive.
And I want to acknowledge Andrew Vandiver is the Associate Director of the Catholic Conference of Kentucky and a good ally of the Institute on these school choice issues. And I'll be mentioning some more about the work that Andy and I have been doing together in a moment. But Andy's actually also the chairman of the board for a group called Ed Choice Kentucky, which is a coalition that the Institute participates in along with the Catholic Conference and a number of other organizations with a lot of support from the Freedom Foundation and the American Federation for Children. And that group, Ed Choice, commissioned a poll last summer. It's a poll of 500 Kentuckians, pretty good margin of error on this. And what it found was overwhelming support for expanding educational options in Kentucky. Regardless of political affiliation, gender, region of the state that you worked in, ethnicity, all of these categories of Kentuckians supported expanding school choice. We even found that educators who responded to the poll, a majority of educators supported expanding school options as well. So it's an idea whose time has come, and the only barrier standing in the way are a handful of folks in the state legislature who haven't gotten the message that this is really what Kentuckians want. And the nice thing is that we have a number of different options to choose from. So I want to spend just a moment talking about each of these policy strategies. And I want to emphasize here that these are not either or options. That what we want to see is a rich menu of school choice policies, because each of them in a different way expands schooling choices for different kinds of families based on different preferences and different needs, and possibly even for different regions of the state. So we'll look at each of these in turn. Basically, public school choice being the first one, scholarship tax credits, charter schools, and then education savings accounts. Right? So interdistrict transfer agreements have long existed in Kentucky. When we think about school choice, we often think first of charter schools or private school choice, but public school choice is probably the most fundamental kind of school choice there is. So we ought to think about the options of families choosing to send their children to a public school other than the one in their particular resides area. In Kentucky, this turns out to be a really contentious issue because school districts can voluntarily enter into agreements with one another to have these sorts of transfers, but they are not bound to do so, and they can negotiate for all kinds of limits. And what this does is it causes the policy to really favor districts that want to strictly limit the number of families who can leave their assigned district to go somewhere else. And And we've seen some very public, bitter, and expensive battles over this particular issue in recent years. We had a quarrel here in Bowling Green a few years ago between the Bowling Green Independent and Warren County Schools. That dispute wound up costing taxpayers about $400,000 in combined legal fees. And it really, the outcome was that the Warren County District prevailed in setting new limits on the number of families that could leave Warren County to go to the Bowling Green District. The Institute favors policies that would allow greater freedom for students to choose the public school of their choice, and to let their seek allocation go with them. So Florida just recently adopted basically a statewide open enrollment for public schools. So you're free to attend any public school if there's space available for you. They give some priority to students with disabilities. They can kind of come to the beginning of the line to exercise that kind of option. That's the kind of broad-based open enrollment we'd like to see in Kentucky. And the Institute has traveled to many problem areas across the state to advocate and to educate policymakers and parents about the advantages of doing this. And one example would be the Callaway County Schools and the Murray Independent District. The Institute did some work to show the positive benefits that had arisen from their 25-year interdistrict transfer agreement when that agreement was under threat. And another time, the Institute helped host a grassroots event at one of the largest churches in Corbin, Kentucky, and a huge crowd turned out for this on a cold Saturday in the middle of winter to voice their support for the existing transfer agreement between Corbin and the Knox County schools. So a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't have school choice on their radar are being educated about the principles behind the concept based on these public school choice issues. I think this is one of those areas where in a community like Bowling Green, where we have relatively strong public schools, folks can identify with the desire to be able to choose the public school for their child based on their family's needs and interests rather than being told where their child must go to school by a group of education bureaucrats or politicians. So that's some public school choice. Take a moment to talk about scholarship tax credits, which are just a little different. And they're different in a couple of ways. One is that they don't involve the transfer of public money directly to private schools. What also makes tax credits a little different is that in Kentucky, there's actually bipartisan support for this concept. So basically what happens with a tax credit is it incentivizes private donations to scholarships that enable low-income and middle-income families to attend a private school. And most private schools have some kind of scholarship program established already. In Louisville, you've got the School Choice Scholarships program that actually provides scholarships to a host of private schools that are there. But the demand for those scholarships far outpaces the funds that are available. And so that basically means we have some uncalculated number of Kentucky families that would like to send their child to a private school and simply can't afford to do so. And so this increases the likelihood that we'll have generous donations to these scholarship funds, because rather than the typical charitable donation, which only affords you a small percentage of tax savings for the donor, a tax credit will give a dollar for dollar reduction up to some predetermined amount to the donor's tax liability. So it makes it a much better opportunity for folks to make donations to these kind of scholarship programs. So as I mentioned, the Institute has partnered with the Catholic Conference to create this organization, EdChoice Kentucky, that is advocating for this policy in Kentucky. And we've helped to craft a bill that has been introduced in the House of Representatives 2 years ago, and just this past legislative session in both the House and the Senate. And if you want, later on, we can talk about some of the features of that bill. But what's really encouraging about it is that our primary sponsor is Tommy Thompson, who is a Democrat from Owensboro. We have 7 other Democratic sponsors, and we had verbal commitments from a number of Democratic legislators, including folks from around here, that if it made it to the floor, they would support it. Another version of the bill came through the Senate, and unfortunately, I think largely because of the focus on budget issues this year, neither bill moved out of committee. But based on this level of interest, especially from House Democrats, we feel like this will be one of our best shots at school choice legislation in the very near future. So we can talk a little bit more later about tax credits if you like. So the third kind of school choice is charter schools, and it's the fastest growing segment of the school choice market. There are currently 43 states in the District of Columbia that have some form of charter, so Kentucky is in a smaller and smaller club in that we don't have charters. There is a lot of mythology, a lot of misinformation about charter schools that is worth confronting. So first of all, charter schools are public schools. And that's an important thing to note because we're frequently accused of using this as a mechanism to privatize public education. Charter schools are public schools. The difference is that they're operated independently from the local school district. So they operate according to a charter or a contract that basically sets their terms of operation, and they enter in this contract with an independent authorizer rather than the local school district. Across the country, about 87% of our charter management organizations are actually nonprofits. So you're only looking at about 13% that are run by for-profit entities. And some of those are large charter management groups like KIPP. Others are sort of mom and pop operations or schools that a group of parents have gone together to try to set up. They have a degree of autonomy in that charter schools are not subject to prevailing union contracts, and they're usually free of a lot of the red tape and regulation that would normally apply to a traditional public school. Many times they specialize in curriculum like STEM or technology-driven instruction, or they use other innovative methods. But they're schools of choice. Nobody can be forced to attend a charter school, but if you want to send your child there, then the state or some portion of the education dollars, depending on the way the law is written, will follow them to that charter school. Contrary to myth, charter schools do not cherry pick the students that they choose. They tend to serve higher percentages of students of color and minority students, and they serve about equal percentages to the traditional public schools of students with disabilities. In exchange for all that autonomy, charter schools have a much higher level of accountability in that, depending on the way the law is written or their charter is written, a low-performing charter school can be shut down. Whereas a traditional public school that is low-performing might continue to suck up taxpayer dollars in perpetuity. So in that sense, charter schools have a real incentive to do well. And they do if you look carefully enough at the data. So one of the things you'll hear is that charter schools do no better than traditional public schools in terms of student achievement. And it's true that if you look at all charters combined compared to all traditional public schools combined, most of the differences wash out. But if you drill down a little deeply, and here in particular we point to a set of studies called the Credo studies, came out of Stanford University in 2013, what they found is that particularly for at-risk students, if they stay in a charter for more than a year, they will outperform their demographically similar peers who stay in a traditional public school. That is especially true for students of color and students of poverty. So those who would benefit most from charter schools are actually the ones who traditionally are benefiting. So here again is a great example of how the Institute has partnered with a really diverse coalition of groups, including the Kentucky Youth Advocates, for example, who on any given day might have different opinions about policy issues than the Bluegrass Institute, but they are also committed to charter schools as a basic social justice issue. And so the Institute, the Kentucky Youth Advocates, the Black Alliance for Educational Options, a really diverse group came together a couple of years ago to form the Kentucky Charter Schools Association and to help craft what we think is one of the best charter bills in the country. If there's any advantage to being one of the last states to go down this road, it's that we can learn from the mistakes of all the other states and do a really good bill. And that bill has passed out of the Senate, I think, for the last 5 years in a row. Our primary sponsor is Senator Mike Wilson from here in Bowling Green. And it's a terrific bill. It's always been dead on arrival in the House of Representatives, but something important has happened. We now have a governor who is a vocal and ardent supporter of charter schools. And that has changed the conversation in Frankfurt about school choice, and particularly around the charter schools issue. And so I think it's getting harder and harder for House Democrats to run from this issue. And again, like tax credits, I think next year we may see, if we don't see a bill, we're at least going to see a much more aggressive push for charters than we've had at any point in the past. Last one I want to mention here is education savings accounts. We haven't talked much about vouchers. Lots of states have some kind of voucher system. An ESA represents a kind of new version of this same concept, but they tend to be a little bit broader in their applicability than a voucher program, in that an ESA functions kind of like a debit card. At the beginning of the school year, a family, their education debit card is loaded with their state education allocation, and then they can use that to procure education services from a variety of vendors. Could be a private school, might be tutoring or occupational services of some sort, or even, depending on the way the law is written, homeschooling expenses could be used with an ESA. One of the other good things about ESAs is that they have withstood a lot of state-level court challenges based on separation of church and state. So as you may know, some states have much more stringent rules about education dollars flowing to religious institutions. But the ESA seems to get around that through a legal argument that says the benefit here is going to the family. The family is the beneficiary. They then work with a variety of vendors to procure the service, and in doing so, it tends to get around those blame amendments. Last year, the Institute sponsored a visit from Dr. Vicki Alger. She's a research fellow at the Independent Institute. She wrote a policy brief for us and also testified to the Joint Interim Education Committee of the State House and Senate last summer about what ESAs might look like in Kentucky. And she was basing her analysis in part on the way they do ESAs in Arizona, where approximately 90% of the state's education allocation per pupil goes on the ESA, and then the home district of the student gets to keep the remainder, and then all of the federal and local amount of money. So in that situation, it becomes very lucrative for the local public schools to support an ESA because they still get funding, but they don't actually have to spend any of it to educate the child. And so part of what Vicki's report did, and you won't be able to see this probably from where you're sitting, but she did a district by district breakdown, and part of what it showed is that, for example, in the Bowling Green City schools, almost $5,000 per child would remain in Bowling Green for every child that left the Bowling Green City schools to use their ESA. So if you design it that way, it's a tremendous win-win, both for the school districts and for the families that get to take advantage of school choice. And so we were really grateful for Vicki Alger's work on this and for her great testimony to the state legislature. So the Institute supports all of these policies, and in this way we kind of follow the philosophy of BAO, the Black Alliance for Educational Options. They talk about their three-sector approach in that all families deserve excellent traditional public schools, public charter schools, and private schools. I think the Institute would take that a step farther and call it a four-sector approach. Homeschooling families pay their school taxes just like everybody else, and as an issue of fairness ought to have some access to the public services that are implied by that contribution. And so in that way, we're trying to do work to create a whole array of schooling options for Kentucky families. In any community of any size, you should have access to at least a few of these excellent options. Part of the way that the Institute gets this done, as I mentioned, is through these coalitions, whether it's the Catholic Conference or BAO or the Kentucky Youth Advocates. This organization is really leveraging its connections with people who are committed to a common set of ideas. You know, even though we may disagree on certain policy issues, where other folks come together and they say, we support this application of personal liberty and economic freedom, we will join hands with them to get the job done. And school choice really does represent a great policy application of those principles of personal liberty and economic freedom. So I want to encourage you, I want to thank you again for coming out. I want to encourage some discussion, and definitely stay with us, follow the work of the Institute and support their work. BIPS.org, which you probably know, and they're on Twitter as well. And then feel free to reach out to me. I'm on Twitter, and you can follow my blog. I appreciate Jim mentioning that. I try to write on there a lot about school choice, but on education reform in general. And so I really look forward to getting to know you all more and continuing this discussion and leveraging it into real change for Kentucky. Thank you all.